Hello and welcome to this field tutorial. I'm Renaud from Mountains, and today we're going to focus on MMFeedbacks. We're going to have a look at many of the feedbacks you can use. Probably not all of them, there are more than 100, but field really comes loaded with different types of feedbacks. Some will focus on interact with a game object, some with the camera or parts of the camera, some with third parties like TextMesh Pro, and some just don't fit in any specific category. So we'll try to go through all of them. Try to see how we can set them up, tweak them, play them. So right now I'm playing a scene that is included in Field. Under MMFeedbacks Demos, you'll find the MMFeedbacks Demo, that's this scene. And as you can see on the left, we've got quite a big list. And that list aims at demonstrating each feedback in isolation, right? So that's usually a good reference point if you want to know how a specific feedback works. It is in that list with a very few exceptions. For example, if I press the animation button, I trigger an animation. If I press the rigid body 2D, you can see that the Mountains logo over there, it's actually a sprite. It has physics properties, physics 2D properties. So, we apply a force using the rigid body 2D feedback. Rigid body would target that stone. And we've got, color grading, we've got tons of them, rotation, and some more complex ones like, a looper, which will trigger feedbacks on a loop. All of these, they are in that demo. And to see how they actually work, you can open like that. You can open that canvas scroll bar, feedbacks, scroll rect content, and there you go. You will see that's the actual UI, like that's the actual buttons. And under each button, you'll find an MM feedback. In this case, I have the scale button selected, and that's the scale feedback. That's the settings that you would see in action if you were to press the scale button. They are all there. Let's say you are looking for, particles instantiation. You just type that here, and you select your button, and then you just have to unfold it, find the feedback. And in this case, most of them, they have an audio source just so that you've pressed the button. And then you have the particles instantiation one. In this case, it instantiates some sparks. Let's have a look at it in action. Just have to find it. Where is it actually? That's a good question. Particles instantiation. There we go. And so you can see that when I press the button, it plays the feedback. Would be the same if I were to press the debug button here. And didn't mention it, but of course the way it works is each button uses a simple button component native in Unity. And here we have an on-click action. And so on click, we basically have dragged that feedback and selected the MMFeedbacks.playFeedbacks method that gives us this nice particle instantiation. All right, that's where you'll find all the info you need, all the reference, all the examples, so keep that in mind. So for today's tutorial, I'm just going to go into a different scene. I'm going to go into the tactical scene. And what this demo does, what it focuses on, if I press play, you can see that when I press space, the little dudes, they start shooting, and this demo showcases, well, how you can do muzzle flashes and all of that, but mostly how to trigger damage floating text. And these three emitters, they showcase different ways of doing that using TextMesh Pro or regular text. But we're just going to ignore that and use that scene for what it is, a nice playground with objects already set up and lit correctly. First thing, talking about lighting, that I want to do is select all my cubes here and uncheck static. It's all really good for lighting. It's quite bad if you want to start to move these cubes at runtime. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty object, name it my feedbacks, and add an MMFeedbacks to it. So by now you should be familiar with that component. It's going to be your feedback manager for the day. And this is a component that can host a number of feedbacks. We can then ask it to play these feedbacks from code, from Unity events, and so on. So we're going to go over a number of feedbacks. I guess a good one to start would be position. So position will let you animate the movement of an object from a start position to a destination position, and with a few other options, but basically animating its position over time. You can see that the first thing it asks for is a target to animate. So I'm going to grab my green cube, and I'm going to rename it green cube so I can find it again later on. And I'm just going to drag and drop it into my animate position target slot. Then I have a bunch of settings, for example, a mode, A to B, a long curve to destination. So we're going to go into detail over what each of these does, because these are notions that you'll find across many feedbacks. Then we have the time scale, scaled and scaled. If you pick scaled, well, it's going to follow whatever time scale you've got going on in your project. So if things are moving in slow motion because your target, your time scale is 0.5, then, you know, the position feedback will animate twice slower. If you go with unscaled, it's going to ignore the current time scale and just move stuff for the duration that you've set. Then we have space, world, local, rect transform if we are working with UI. A duration, I'm just going to go with maybe 2 seconds so that we have the time to see what's happening. A curve on which to animate things. You can pick any of these custom ones, preset, and you can also, of course, edit the curve to do whatever you want with it. Allow additive plays. We're going to see in a second what it does. And then we have our coordinates. So relative position, it's an important checkbox. What it does is if you check it, it's going to consider these values as relative and add to them the initial position of the object when the feedback starts playing. So yeah, I guess we can just press play and start to see what it does. So because we checked relative position, you can see that these values have changed. It's gonna at initialization, it grabbed the initial position of our object and added it to these values. So you can see that we have like 0.382, and that's the actual coordinates of our green cube. The coordinates of the feedback itself don't matter in that context. So now if I were to press play, you can see that I'm moving along the curve that I designed. I'm going to go with something simpler. There we go. So I'm going to start making a few changes. So for example, let's say we just want to move vertically. So I want to go from 0 to 1 or maybe 2. I press play again. I should move the camera maybe. It goes up like that. Along that weird curve I did, if I change the curve and select my feedback again, whoop, we get something more natural. And as you can see, every time I play, it goes back to A. It goes back to my destination, my initial position. That's because I'm in A to B mode. There are other modes. So for example, to destination, this one is gonna take a transform as our destination. So let's say I select this cube here. It doesn't want to get selected for some reason. Okay. And I'm gonna rename it red cube. And I'm also gonna move that camera because it's getting It's getting annoying. And I'm just going to move it like this. That's better. All right. So I'm going to select my feedbacks again. So we've got the green cube. That's what we are animating. And I want it to go to the red cube as its destination, right? So if I press play now, you can see that it's going to the red cube following the curve I specified. If I select my green cube again in scene view, and now I move it to this position, for example, if I were to press my feedback again, you can see it's still going to the red cube, but from that origin position. So that's quite different from the A to B mode. And lastly, we have a long curve, which gives us also a lot of control. So for example, I can say I want to animate just the Z position, maybe, along a curve that does, I don't know, something like that, maybe. And I'm going to allow additive plays. And I'm going to remap the curve one. So what remapping means is that you have this curve, and the curve usually goes from 0 to 1, and you navigate between these two spaces. And maybe you want your Z position to not go between 0 and 1, but you would like it to be, I don't know, 50, right? So you would take that point and drag it to 15, like that. The issue is, it makes for a curve that becomes very hard to read, and it doesn't really scale well if you change your mind. So instead, we are using remapping. So remapping says that if you have a value of 1 on the curve, it will become 15. And if you have a value of 0, it will become 5. So that will mean a movement between 5 and 15, whatever it is you're moving. We're going to go with 0 and 2, and we're going to press play and see what that does. So as you can see, we are moving on the Z-axis along that curve, and it starts from 0. When it goes to 1 on the curve, it means 2 in world. Then it goes back to something, and then it goes a bit above 1, probably 1.25, and which means in our world, 1.25 multiplied by 2, so that gives us this movement, which makes the tiny cubes move. So that's fun. And because we have allow additive plays, if I am to press play multiple times, you can see that I allow these to happen. If I uncheck that, it will wait until it's finished to start again. So depending on what you're animating and why and how, you may or may not want to check that checkbox. So that covers pretty much the position feedback. Of course, that can be combined with timing options. My mouse is killing me. And there are others. There's rotation, there's scale, wiggle, and destination, which sort of combines them all. And this one is a bit different. Just going to show you, I skipped it, but if I were to show you, let's say the rotation one, you'd find that it's fairly similar to the position. You'll find also modes that, to destination, additive, things you'll start to recognize. Also moving stuff over time on curves. The destination one, the way it works is it's sort of like the destination mode we've seen before. I'm going to grab my red cube here, and I'm going to move it maybe change its scale a bit and change its rotation, like so, right? So if I'm going to remove my position feedback, we're just going to go with the destination one. So I want to animate the green cube, and I want it to sort of conform to the red cube's state. And I want that to happen over 2 seconds. And that's the curve I'm going to use to drive my properties. That's my global curve. I could decide to force destination on end. So that means that at the end of the curve, I would force that state. But you can see that I wanted to sort of go to that state, come back to normal. So if I press play, I have all of these checked. So it's going to animate the position, the rotation, and the scale. And if I press play, you can see that maybe if I go into scene mode, so it goes to conform to that state, then comes back. If I change my curve here for something weird and not very practical, you can see it just sort of blends between the two states. I could decide, of course, to have separate position curves. So for example, the position would be, I don't know, like this. And so as you can see, the position ends here. It doesn't like go back to 0. But if I just cancel that, you know, you can just play with it. It's the combinations are sort of infinite. And because it's a to destination, you know, it's going to grab whatever state your object was in when it started. So you could move it at runtime and it would always take the current position as its initial position and just move. So that's transform feedbacks. That's how they work. And once you understand these, that's going to give you a good head start for all the other ones. So maybe let's now remove that one and have a look at another family of feedbacks, maybe the camera ones. So that's something that most games usually use, and you'll find very different ones into that family. Maybe the first thing we can have a look at is the maybe camera shake, right? That's iconic. So this one doesn't use Cinemachine. You'll find another one that uses Cinemachine impulses. But this one is easy to set up. So maybe I'm just going to go and does it work if I do that? Disable the brain. So it just becomes regular camera again. Let's see, I have my game view here. If I were to move my scene, my virtual camera, it doesn't impact. I think we're good. So this camera shake, it requires a shaker that's written here. And for every feedback that requires, let's say, an external element somewhere else in the scene, that's always going to be written here. So that's a good place to look at. If you added a feedback, it does nothing, and you're like, what? Why? Probably the explanation is here. So it requires a or even if you don't know, you can just type camera shake and camera shaker will pop. What this thing does is it basically uses an wiggle. So that's another component. And wiggle, so my mouse has really decided to double click 20 times every time I do a click. So wiggle. As you can see, I check position and I have wiggle permitted. So, well, it wiggles and it's going to just go from random position to another random position. It's got different modes. Random right now, we're going to go with noise. And that's it. We just leave it like that and we're good. The camera shaker, what it's going to do is it's going to get events triggered by your code maybe, or in this case by a feedback. And when it gets it, it's going to say to the wiggle, start wiggling. You know, so we want to have it not wiggle in most cases. So we just uncheck wiggle permitted. And when we press play, we get a very non-moving camera, just like we want. So on the camera shake feedback, what we're going to do is say unfold that, and we're going to target our channel 0. That's the channel that we had on our main camera here. So shakers, they have that concept of channel. It's an int value that you can specify. And let's say you had 5 cameras in your scene, and you wanted to really shake only camera 1, you would maybe set it to channel 1 and channel 1 on your feedback, and they would just talk to each other. It's like channels on a walkie-talkie, right? And so going back to our feedback, here we can define a number of settings. I'm just gonna go and press play, and you can see that, well, maybe if I bring my game view back. So every time I press play, my feedback plays, of course, and I shake the camera. I can change a bunch of things like the duration. I could go with maybe 1, so it shakes for 1 second. I could change the amplitude to 1, so now it shakes much more. And with 0.1, you know, it's more subtle. And the frequency is, of course, the frequency of the shake. So the higher you make it, and if you make it very low, you know, like it moves way slower. So you can just, you know, enjoy that. And you can also specify different amplitudes per axis. So if I were to do this, well, that was a dumb number. But okay, if I make it 0 to 0, well, it shakes vertically. If I make it to 0, 0, it's going to shake horizontally. And if I make it this, it's going to shake on that weird axis. So that way you can do, let's say, directional screen shakes. Now, let's maybe have a look at another camera example. So the Cinemachine ones, I think I did the Cinemachine Impulse in the Getting Started tutorial, not going to go over that one. Clipping planes, fade, field of view, zoom. Let's do a zoom. So likewise, you know, the text box here, it tells you that you need camera zoom component on your camera. So, you know, let's comply to that and add camera zoom. So of course, what this will do, the camera zoom, it's going to impact the field of view of our camera if it's a perspective one. And I can just press play. Now that we have our zoom shaker, you can see that when I press play, I get a zoom. I can, of course, change the duration. So right now it's tenths of a second. Now, if I make it 1, it lasts for longer. In this case, I'm in 4 modes. So that means that it's going to go to a field of view of 30 from, you know, whatever field of view I have. And it's going to stay there for 1 second. And I can tweak the speed of the transition. So I could go with, if it's 1 second, maybe 0.4, and you can see that, you know, the transition is way longer. I can also change it to set, in which case it's going to set it to 30 and stay there forever until I decide to change it. So now if I set it to 50 from, let's say, another feedback, I would go back. I can set it to 10. It's going to stay there, and if I press reset, it resets to its initial value. So these are the modes you can use. Usually you would go with maybe 4, but if you go with set, maybe you would have one MMFeedbacks that has a set to 10, and another MMFeedbacks triggered by another condition in your game set to reset. So a good example would be, I don't know, a sniper scope. When you activate it, you play that feedback that sets it to 10, super zoom. And when you exit your scope by right-clicking, well, then you play a reset feedback. And I think that's it for the camera ones. The other ones, they are pretty much self-explanatory. What else? We have the debug. So that's one that may be useful when you are learning feedbacks. Might not be a bad thing to go over it. As you can expect, this one just logs something to the console. So hello people, And every time you're going to be playing your feedback, it's going to do an entry here. You can even change the color to have fancy debug logs. And it also has options, you know, to display or not the frame count and so on. So, but that's just a good way when you're like, oh, that feedback is not playing. Make sure you have a debug log. So that way you can make sure maybe you're not even triggering the feedback, or maybe it's another problem, but that helps you at least pinpoint where it could be coming from. Another popular or at least frequently used feedback would be post-processing. So I don't know which one we could go with. Something that shows maybe bloom. I don't know if I have bloom in that particular scene. I'm going to select my post-processing volume. It's right here. As you can see, these demos, they use the standard render pipeline, which in my opinion is still the only good one. But there are feedbacks for URP as well, and some new ones for HDRP that are coming soon, but may not be out at the time of you viewing that video. So here I have my post-process volume, and I have a bloom already override. So you can see with and without bloom, not much of a difference. But if I were to raise the intensity, you know, it blooms, right? So we can already see that it starts to really show around, let's say 40. I'm gonna go back to 1. So the feedbacks that use post-processing, they require a shaker as well. So just like for the camera, you want to make sure that you have something to receive things on your post-process volume. And to do that, you just add a component, and we want to target the bloom. So I'm just going to type bloom, and you can see that it makes my bloom shaker pop. I just add it, forget about it, that's it. Then I go back to my feedback, and you can see that I have two things I can play on. So of course there's the channel, the duration. Let's make it, let's say 1 second. I can decide to reset values and so on. And then I can play on the intensity and the threshold. Today I'm just going to touch the intensity, and instead of moving it to 1, I think it's already at 1, I'm going to go all the way up to, let's say 45. I'm going to press play, and once the game is running, I press play on my MMFeedbacks, and you can see that over time I'm animating the bloom value. Of course, I could change that curve for anything. Honestly, don't know what negative values do, but that may not be such a good idea. Well, it does nothing. I think it clamps at 0, which is a good thing. Otherwise, it could have caused the destruction of the universe, maybe. And pretty much all post-process effects, they work like that. So chromatic aberration will have more options. Not chromatic aberration. I was actually going for color grading, which has more options. You know, you can play on the exposure, hue, shift, and so on. That just gives you control over every value or relevant ones into the post-processing effects. If you're into events, there are events feedbacks. So there are two. Load scene, which is fairly specific, and as you can guess, will let you load a new scene. And then there are events, which are regular Unity events. So you can associate events to the moment where this feedback is played. That would be play events. When it's stopped, stop events. Initialize, reset. So usually you would go with play events. I'm going to kill that mouse. So play events. What you can do with that is you can call any method on any object. I'm just going to go with something fairly stupid and say I'm going to drag the red cube, and I'm going to call its setActive method. So what that's going to do is when I play that feedback, that events feedback is going to play. It's going to call the GameObject.setActive method on the red cube, turning it to inactive, which apparently doesn't work at all. Or isn't that the red cube I was expecting? Oh, I have 2 red cubes. Okay, I was targeting the wrong one. So let's try it again. So I was aiming for that one at the bottom, but I selected this one. So let's start again. I select my feedback, and you can see the red cube I target is the weird rotated one here. Press play, it turns off. If I were to change the value here, in that event, it turns back on. So that's just a neat way of targeting pretty much anything in your game. You have your custom classes, you are using other assets, and you don't have a dedicated feedback to target them. Well, you can use that. That's like the universal MMFeedback. And just a word of advice on that. This could look like visual scripting. This could look like MMFeedbacks is designed to handle game logic. I wouldn't recommend it. I really designed that system to handle game feel and to trigger things and sort of not worry about it. That's the reason for the shakers. That's the reason for the event-based logic for most of them. But I've seen things, I've seen people create entire games using MMFeedbacks. Theoretically possible. In my opinion, not very scalable and harder to maintain, but you do do whatever you prefer. So moving on, I'm gonna remove that one, and I don't know what's next. GameObject. So here we have a bunch of so it's a mixed bunch. We've got animation. Broadcast, destroy simply destroys the target, so that's an easy one. I'm gonna grab my red cube. Really considering changing my mouse before I stop recording this thing. I press play, and if I go back to scene, when I press play, it destroys the red cube. Not something I would recommend doing much at runtime. I would prefer using the set active one, which will have the same effect for the user, but won't actually destroy something at runtime, which is more costly than just disabling it. So if I press play, you can see it does absolutely nothing because I didn't check any of these checkboxes. If I check set state on play, I can set it to inactive. So in this case, it turns it off. And if I click on toggle, it's gonna toggle it every time. Active will force it to active, while toggle changes the state. It's just that my mouse is double clicking. It is extremely, extremely annoying. All right, but if I really concentrate on the clicking, sort of works. And what else is there? The maybe instantiate object. All right, so for that we need a prefab. I'm going to make a prefab of that weird red cube by dragging it, and then I'm just going to move my feedback over there, and I'm going to open the red cube. I'm going to add a rigid body to it, which hopefully will make it fall if I drag it in the scene and display. It is working. It is really good. Just going to remove that extra one. And so in the instantiate feedback, you can see it asks for a game object to instantiate. I can just click on my red cube, the prefab from the project, drag it here. I can decide where I want the feedback to spawn the object. So it can be the feedback position. It could be yet another transform in the scene. And it could be just a world position. I could say, I want that to spawn at 0, 5, 0, because there's something important in the world for me at that position. I could also have it be driven by a script. I'm just going to go with the feedback position, so stuff is going to drop from here. I can also have an object pool. So that's not going to work for us here because our red cube is just going to fall forever. But if we were to have VFX that play some particles and then disable themselves, that would work. Gonna press play on that. And so now every time I press play, a cube falls from the position I set, and it should be, no, okay, I set an offset of 5 vertically. So now with an offset of 0, you know, the cubes, they just spawn. That's actually fun. I think there's a game there. So that's the instantiate object feedback. And other feedback we could go with maybe TextMesh Pro. There are a bunch to pick from. They all work pretty much the same. We're going to go with the font size one, and we're going to create a new text object. TextMesh Pro, here we go. We're going to have it say something like heal. I have a lot of inspiration today. And so in our TextMesh Pro feedback, we can just drag our new text here. So that's going to be our target TextMesh Pro text. And we're going to move on a curve. So this is a sort of tiny widget you'll see frequently. You can choose between a regular animation curve or just a twin, twin, in which case you have access to that list. It's like ready-made curves for you to use. Or you can use the animation curve. And in this case, we're going to go with this animation curve. We're going to remap, I don't know the size of font here. So we are at 36. So we're going to go from, let's say, 36 to, oh, it's relative values. So 0 to 20. Let's see what that does. So that's gonna go from 36 to 56. And you can see it is working. It looks weird, but it is working. And if we were to say -20, you know, we would scale down the thing. So that's how you change the size over time. And after that, we can go with, I don't know, they are all pretty much the same. Character spacing, for example. Same thing, you just drag the TextMesh Pro and you say 20. And when you press play, you can see that it changes the character spacing. And if we were to change also the font size over 2 seconds, and we press, you know, we do both at once, you can start combining these TextMesh Pro effects to get some more interesting patterns. All right, let's look at another family of feedbacks, maybe time, freeze frame, one of my favorites. So it's the idea that you stop time for a very short duration, and it makes you feel usually the impact of a hit. That's been popularized by Street Fighter. So as you can see here in the description, it says it requires a time manager in your scene to work. So we're going to add one. Create empty. We're going to call it time manager. And we're going to add a time manager script to it. And we don't have to do anything. We could just forget about it. We usually would drop it with our other managers in the scene, maybe. It's just what I'm going to do. And it's just going to sit there. And that's the important thing to know about it, is that if you manage time in your game, if you change the time scale, it has to go through the time manager if you're using it. Otherwise, things are going to get messy and you're going to have two systems manipulating your time scale at once. May not be what you want. So going back to our freeze frame, if I were to press play, go back to scene view. Now, every time I press play on my feedback, it does a freeze frame. So because 0.2 is not super visible, you can see that this is more like impactful. I would go personally between 0.2 and 0.05, 0.05 like that. That's my value, or 0.02. That's also good. Really depends on the kind of game you're making and the impact of the hit. Something else we can do is add a timescale modifier. So this also plays with the time manager. And what this does is it's going to let us manipulate the timescale over time, which becomes fairly meta, but it's the idea that, as that feedback plays, it slows down time and then it comes back. So we have this cube moving in a very linear fashion, slows down, comes back. And we can also have it change. It works basically like the zoom that we've seen before. And here we can say, okay, change the timescale to 0.5. And now, and forever, until we decide to change it, the timescale is going to be 0.5. So if I go back to my game and start shooting, you can see that everything from physics to feedbacks, everything moves slowly. So that's a very John Woo vibe here. Or Zack Snyder, I guess. And Justice League was so long. So yeah, you can change the scale like that. And if you want, you can also reset it, and that sort of unpiles the thing and brings you back to normal. So just like for the zoom, where you had a set method and a reset method, you can see that it's the same pattern here. And that's the trick with MMFeedbacks. You're going to see the same patterns. They're all made by the same me. So you will find similar elements across feedbacks. What else? So we have a bunch of UI ones, but they work pretty much like the transform ones. They're not super interesting. Time with scene renderer. All right. Maybe let's start with some texture scale. I'm going to drag my green cube and put it here. And I'm going to target the main text, hoping these cubes use a material that has a property like that. I think so. And I'm going to make the duration to be 2. And we're going to change that from relative values of 0 to 1. Let's see what it does. So we are targeting this cube here, and you can see that every time I press play, it changes the texture scale. This could be useful, not exactly sure in what situation, but sometimes it could be. And so under renderer, you'll see things that, as the name implies, will impact the renderer. So you can change the texture offset. You could also have stuff that blinks. You can just simply also change the material. So for example, if I target my green cube again, I can say, okay, I want you to change material every time I play the feedback. So I could have an array of materials. I'm going to go with No, that's not the ones I want. MMBPR. And I'm going to go with, I don't know, a dark gray. I'm going to go with a yellow and a light gray. Okay, that's too many clicks. And if I press play, so we're going to look at our green one here, and I'm going to play, and you can see now it's yellow, now it's gray, now it's dark gray, gray. Well, it changes colors. Well, it changes material, really. That can be a useful feedback when you change state, for example. What else? You can have something flicker. I'm not sure exactly what the outcome will be with that particular material, but let's try. You can see it flickers. So that's done by really changing the color. So in most cases, it's going to multiply, really. You can use different colors, of course, and that gives you different effects. So the cool thing with that, it's very much out of the box, and you don't need to have a specific shader on the other end to pilot. So now, if we look at other renderer feedbacks, there are some interesting ones. Texture offset, scale, flicker, these will sort of work with any renderer, any material. There are some material as well, it targets really the renderer. But there's stuff like, for example, let's say the shader controller. That's an interesting one. So it works more or less like the float controller that we saw before, but it targets, you guessed it, shader properties. For that, you're likely gonna have to use your own shaders that expose your own properties, or you grab some from the internet, but won't really work out of the box because Unity standard shaders, they don't expose many values. If I were to change the shader that is used by that green cube here for something like a more mountains controlled emission one. So as the name implies, this one exposes an emission value, and I'm gonna go with yeah, that's really ugly. Let's go with somebody remember the name of these. So proto textures green dots, right? So there we go, and I'm gonna make it emission false of 0. It doesn't look really good with that lighting, but you get the idea. It just it works. Oh, I can play on the opacity. That's a good one. I rarely use it. But anyway, the point was that if you change that emission force value, you can see that it starts glowing, right? Because of the bloom we have in that scene. So we could decide that we want that thing to sort of periodically glow when we have a feedback playing, and we're just going to go with that color. So anyway, what we're going to need on that cube is a shader controller, just like we had a float controller before. And we're going to say, okay, I want to target this mesh renderer, and I want the property name to be, in this case, emission force. So emission force. You can see I put a tiny underscore here. That's because I've been here before, but if you were to go into debug mode on your inspector, you can see here that it's got a number of properties, and one of them is called emission force. So using debug mode, you can find the exact name of the property you after, or you can just open your shader in any text editor and you'll find it. So the shader controller, like the float controller we've seen before, it can work on its own, and you can have it work in ping pong mode, for example. Let's say between a value of 0 and 50 over a second. And you can see that it goes, maybe 50 was too much, right? 10, already a lot. But you can see we have our thing sort of pulsating like that. We have this nice debug that shows us the progress. And we can also pick different twins to have something less linear. But like we did before with our float controller, we're going to set that one in driven mode. And I think even one time would work. We're just going to go with one time. And on our feedback here, we're going to say we want to target this shader controller. So I'm dragging the green cube into the slot. I want it to be a one-time thing, and I want to go from an amplitude of 0 to 10. So along that curve, so it's going to go from not very bright to super bright to not bright. And as you can see, it works, which is quite satisfying. And if we make it very short, or even shorter, that becomes a nice maybe hit feedback. You know, your 3D model is taking bullets and good way to do that. Extremely cheap as well, because that's all on the GPU. And on the renderer, you will find others. You can manipulate the fog, you can manipulate all sorts of things. Transform time, renderer, post-process we've seen. The pose and the loop are going to be part of one more tutorial. Particles, fairly simple. Instantiation would be just like when we were instantiating objects earlier. Particles play simply require that you have a particle system in your scene set to burst mode, and you drag it into this slot and it plays the particles. What else? So loop gonna be covered later. Light, I think, was in another tutorial. Haptics, there's an entire, I think, multiple nice vibrations tutorials out there. So it's targeting another of my assets called nice vibrations, focusing on haptics and rumble. So targeting iOS, Android, or gamepads. And this feedback will let you trigger them in any possible ways. GameObject, so animation, broadcast, all sorts of good things. Not going to go into the details of all of them, but if you feel like something is not clear in their documentation, don't hesitate to let me know. I'll be happy to do more tutorials covering more feedbacks. But I think it's pretty much it. The audio ones are going to be also part of a dedicated MM Sound Manager tutorial to cover at least all of these. And if you're interested in the other ones, well, sound is super straightforward. Audio source can be another way of playing sounds. This one requires that you've already created an audio source. I guess we can just do that quickly. So you create an audio source in your scene that gives you access to all of its options. You pick a sound, and in your, I'm going to call that, I don't know, my audio source. And so now in your feedback, you can just drag the audio source, choose a mode, so you could play, pause, and so on. And when you press play, so you play the sound, basically, that's what it does. There are a number of others. Audio filters, they take an audio source and its filter and they modify it. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good tool of all the feedbacks, and it should give you a good idea of how they work. In a previous tutorial, we saw how to play them. Now you've seen how to customize them. There is another tutorial focusing on their many settings, either at the MMFeedbacks level or at the feedback level. And one more tutorial focusing on a few core concepts like loops and pauses. That should give you really all you need to know about feedbacks. I hope you'll create something really cool with these, and I hope that you learned something new today. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.